The photograph was burned at the edges, but her smile remained. General Saburo Takeda held it between his fingers as the sirens began their nightly scream across Tokyo. Another raid was coming. Another 1,000 souls would rise as smoke before dawn. He tucked the photograph into his breast pocket, close to his heart where his daughter would always stay, and walked toward the underground bunker where the fate of 80 million people would be decided by men who refused to see the truth. October 1945 had brought cold rain and colder news. The Americans had taken Okinawa 4 months ago, and the cost had been staggering on both sides. 100,000 Japanese soldiers dead. 12,000 Americans killed. The Imperial Navy existed now only in memory and rust at the bottom of the Pacific. The Army Air Force had thrown everything it had at the invasion fleet, 3,000 aircraft in 10 weeks of kamikaze attacks, and still the Americans kept coming. They always kept coming. Takeda descended 3 levels beneath the ruined streets of Tokyo to reach Imperial General Headquarters. The walls were reinforced concrete, thick enough to survive anything except a direct hit from the massive bombs the Americans had dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those weapons haunted every conversation now, though no one spoke of them directly. To acknowledge such power was to acknowledge defeat, and defeat was a word that did not exist in the vocabulary of the Japanese High Command. The war room smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. 20 officers stood around a table covered with maps of the home islands. Colored pins marked troop positions, supply depots, and the beaches where the Americans would land. Everyone knew where the invasion would come. Kyushu, the southernmost of the main islands, with its wide bays and gentle beaches. Operation Ketsugo, the decisive battle for the homeland, had been planned for months. 14 divisions waited in the mountains. 350,000 soldiers prepared to die. War Minister Korechika Anami spoke first, his voice hard as temple bronze. The Americans believe we are broken. They are wrong. When they set foot on our sacred soil, they will find a nation of warriors. Every man, woman, and child will fight. We will make the beaches of Kyushu run red with enemy blood. Admiral Takejiro Onishi nodded in fierce agreement. He had created the Kamikaze Corps a year ago, sending young pilots on one-way missions into American ships. The tactic had worked at first, dozens of vessels sunk, thousands of sailors killed. But the Americans had adapted. Their ships now bristled with anti-aircraft guns. The success rate of kamikaze attacks had fallen from 1 in 4 to 1 in 20. Still, Onishi believed in the divine wind. He had to believe. Too many young men had died for his faith to waver now. Takeda listened in silence as the generals outlined their plans. Coastal defense batteries hidden in caves. Suicide boats packed with explosives. Human mines, soldiers who would bury themselves in the sand and detonate bombs as American tanks rolled over them. The plans were detailed and professional, the product of months of careful work. They were also insane. The numbers did not lie, and Takeda had spent his career reading numbers. American intelligence estimated the invasion force at over 1 million men, supported by the largest naval armada in human history. The Japanese had fuel for 3 weeks of operations, ammunition for perhaps 6 weeks of heavy fighting, and almost no capacity to replace losses. The factories that had once produced aircraft and tanks now sat as burned skeletons after months of firebombing. Food was running short. Medicine was almost gone. The nation was starving, and the general spoke of victory. After the meeting, Takeda walked through the ruins of what had once been a garden behind the imperial palace. The cherry trees were blackened stumps now, killed by fire and neglect. He was not surprised to find Prince Naruhiko Higashikuni waiting in the shadows. The prince was the emperor's uncle, a man who moved between the military and the palace, trusted by both sides and fully committed to neither. The emperor has doubts, the prince whispered, glancing at the guards who stood too far away to hear. He asks questions that no one will answer. How many more must die? When does honor become extinction? But the generals have surrounded him with walls of duty and tradition. He cannot act alone. Takeda understood. Emperor Hirohito was a god in the eyes of his people, but even gods could be caged. The military had controlled Japan for 15 years, leading the nation from one war to the next, from China to Southeast Asia to the Pacific. They would not surrender power easily. They would not surrender at all. 3 days later, Takeda stood on a beach in Kyushu, watching fishermen's sons dig trenches with farming tools. They had been given bamboo spears and told to charge American tanks. Their eyes held the hollow look of men who knew they were already dead. Behind them, schoolgirls practiced throwing hand grenades. None of them weighed more than 90 pounds. The coded message arrived at midnight on October 28. American naval forces had departed Okinawa. Over 3,000 ships were sailing toward Japan. The invasion would begin in 4 days. Takeda burned the message and stared at the horizon, where the first light of false dawn was beginning to glow. His daughter's smile pressed against his heart. "Forgive us," he whispered to no one. "Forgive us for what comes next." The sea had turned gray with ships. Sergeant Hideki Yamamoto pressed his eye to the observation slit of his bunker and tried to count them, but the numbers defeated him after 200. They stretched from horizon to horizon, a forest of steel masts and radar towers that blocked out the morning sun. The Americans had brought more firepower to the beaches of Ariake Bay than Japan had produced in a decade of war. And somewhere in that armada, death was loading into landing craft and preparing to come ashore. November 1, 1945, X-Day, began with thunder. The naval bombardment started at 0400, and by 0600 the beaches of southern Kyushu had ceased to exist as recognizable terrain. 16-inch shells from American battleships carved craters 30 feet deep. Rockets screamed overhead in waves of hundreds, turning the defensive positions into landscapes of fire and shattered concrete. Hideki pressed himself against the floor of his bunker and prayed to ancestors he was not sure were listening. The earth shook so hard that his teeth rattled. General Yoshio Kurino watched the bombardment from his command post 5 miles inland, deep in a mountain tunnel that had taken 6 months to dig. He commanded the 40th Army, 350,000 men tasked with defending Kyushu against the greatest invasion force in history. On paper, it was a formidable defense. In reality, half his soldiers were conscripts with 8 weeks of training. Many had never fired their rifles. They would face Marines who had fought their way across the Pacific, men who had taken Tarawa and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The first wave hit the beaches at 0830. Through the smoke and debris, American Marines poured from their landing craft and sprinted across the sand. Japanese machine guns opened fire from hidden positions, cutting down dozens of men in the first 30 seconds. But more kept coming. Always more. The landing craft were like the heads of a hydra, destroy one and 2 more appeared behind it. Hideki's bunker became an island in a sea of chaos. By noon, the Americans had established a beachhead a mile wide and half a mile deep. They had lost over 4,000 men killed and wounded. It was a terrible price, but they could afford it. Japan could not. Every Japanese soldier who fell was irreplaceable. Every machine gun that went silent would never fire again. In his mountain headquarters, Kurino received the order he had been dreading. Tokyo demanded an immediate counterattack with the armored reserve. 53 tanks, the last operational armor on Kyushu, were to charge the beaches and push the Americans back into the sea. His chief of staff, Colonel Sato Matsuda, argued against the order with barely controlled fury. "They will be slaughtered in the open," Matsuda said. "The American planes will find them within an hour. We should wait for darkness." But orders were orders. The tanks of the 6th Tank Brigade rolled toward the coast at 1,400 hours, their engines rumbling through the mountain valleys. American reconnaissance aircraft spotted them within 40 minutes. By 1600, the sky was filled with corsairs and Hellcats, diving in waves with bombs and rockets. The tanks had no air cover. They had no anti-aircraft weapons. They had only their armor and their courage, and neither was enough. Kurino listened to the radio reports as his tank brigade died. 46 vehicles destroyed. Over 1,000 men killed. The survivors retreated into the mountains, their treads throwing up mud and blood. It was the largest tank battle in Japanese history, and it had lasted less than 3 hours. That night, a coded message arrived from Tokyo. It was not an official communication, no stamps, no seals, no bureaucratic trail. Just a single question from General Saburo Takeda: how many more must die before we admit the truth? Kirino read the message twice, then burned it. He did not answer. There was nothing to say. On the beaches, Sergeant Hideki Yamamoto crawled from his shattered bunker as darkness fell. He was one of 11 survivors from a garrison of 200. The sand around him was covered with bodies, Japanese and American alike, united now in the democracy of death. He found his rifle and began walking inland, toward the mountains where the next line of defense waited. The Americans had taken the beaches, but they had not taken Japan. Not yet. The real battle was just beginning. In the mountains of Kyushu, 200,000 soldiers waited in caves and tunnels that stretched for miles. They had enough ammunition for weeks of fighting. They had enough courage for years. And they had orders that would never change: fight until the last man falls. Kirino stared at a map of his shrinking territory and made a decision. He would not waste his men in futile charges against overwhelming firepower. He would bleed the Americans for every inch of ground. He would make them pay a price so terrible that even victory would taste like defeat. It was not a plan for winning. It was a plan for dying well. In the autumn of 1945, that was the only plan Japan had left. The boy sat alone in the darkness, carving a wooden sword from a piece of broken furniture. He was 10 years old, and everyone he had ever loved was dead. His father had died at Leyte Gulf. His mother and sisters had burned in the firebombing of Kagoshima. Now he lived in a cave with 2,000 soldiers, waiting for the Americans who had taken everything from him. When General Saburo Takeda found him in the deepest tunnel of the mountain headquarters, the boy looked up with eyes that held no fear. "I want to kill them," he said. "Teach me how." December had brought snow to the highlands of Kyushu, and with it a war unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Americans had pushed 20 miles inland from the beaches, but every mile had cost them dearly. The Japanese had abandoned conventional warfare and melted into the mountains, fighting from cave networks that stretched for hundreds of miles. Some tunnels were natural, carved by water over millions of years. Others had been dug by hand, using pickaxes and shovels, by soldiers and civilians who knew they were building their own tombs. Takeda had arrived from Tokyo 3 weeks after the invasion, sent to coordinate the final defense of Kyushu. What he found was an army that defied description. They had lost 60% of their heavy weapons in the first week. They were running low on food, medicine, and hope. But they had not broken. In the darkness of the caves, men who should have surrendered continued to fight with a determination that bordered on madness. The cave hospital was carved from solid rock 200 feet below the surface. Wounded soldiers lay in rows along the tunnel walls, their bandages made from civilian clothing because the medical supplies had run out weeks ago. A doctor named Tanaka moved between the patients with quiet efficiency, doing what he could with what little he had. "We lose more men to infection than to American bullets," he told Takeda. "I have performed amputations with kitchen knives. I have used sake as anesthetic. Still they die." Outside the caves, the war continued with savage intensity. American forces advanced during the day, using tanks and artillery and air support that the Japanese could not match. At night, Japanese raiders emerged from hidden tunnels to attack supply lines and rear areas. Colonel Matsuda led one such raid against an American depot near Miyazaki, destroying 2 million pounds of food and ammunition. Of the 800 men who went on the mission, only 200 returned. Matsuda himself was among the dead, but the greatest horror came from the civilian population. The Japanese military had armed thousands of ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, schoolteachers, and told them to resist the invasion with whatever they had. Some strapped explosives to their bodies and ran toward American tanks. Others attacked with bamboo spears and sharpened farm tools. The results were predictable. Whole villages were destroyed in the fighting, their inhabitants killed by bullets they never saw coming. Takeda ordered the civilian attack stopped, but his authority only reached so far. The fanatics in Tokyo continued to demand total resistance, and local commanders interpreted those orders according to their own beliefs. Some refused to sacrifice civilians. Others embraced the concept of gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, believing that death in battle was preferable to the dishonor of survival. The radio from Tokyo crackled with demands that Takeda could not fulfill. War Minister Anami wanted a counterattack that would throw the Americans back to the beaches. He wanted proof that the spirit of Yamato was unbroken. He wanted miracles from men who had only their lives left to give. Takeda learned to lie smoothly and professionally. He reported preparations that did not exist. He promised offensives that would never come. Each lie bought another week, another 1,000 lives. At night, he sat in his quarters and wrote letters he would never send. To his dead daughter, he wrote of the boy with the wooden sword, whom he had taken under his protection. To his wife, who had died of illness 2 years ago, he wrote of the impossible choices he faced every day. To the emperor, he wrote the truth that no one else would speak: the war is lost, and every day we fight is a day of pointless dying. A coded message arrived from his allies in Tokyo on Christmas Day. The emperor had begun to speak privately of ending the war. But the hardliners were watching, and they would not surrender quietly. They were planning something, a coup, perhaps, or worse. The message ended with a warning: the final battle may not be against the Americans. It may be against ourselves. Takeda read the message by candlelight, then looked at the boy sleeping in the corner of his quarters. The wooden sword lay beside him, unfinished. Outside, American artillery rumbled in the distance, a sound like endless thunder. The general knew that time was running out. He would have to choose soon, between orders and conscience, between duty and life. The weight of that choice pressed down on him like the mountain itself. The order came at midnight, sealed with the personal stamp of the war minister. General Takeda held it under the dim light of a kerosene lamp and read the words that would send 200,000 men to their deaths. All forces were to launch a coordinated counterattack at dawn. Every soldier, every weapon, every resource was to be thrown against the American lines. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no tomorrow. This was the final gamble, the last throw of the dice. Takeda set the paper down and felt the weight of the mountain pressing against his heart. January 1946 had brought bitter cold and bitter news. The Americans now controlled half of Kyushu, and their forces were massing for the final push into the mountains. Intelligence reports spoke of a second invasion fleet preparing to land near Tokyo itself, Operation Coronet. They called it, a force even larger than the one that had taken the beaches 2 months ago. Japan was being crushed between two hammers, and the generals in Tokyo still spoke of victory, but Tokyo itself was burning with a different kind of fire. Takeda's allies had sent word of chaos in the capital. Young officers had attempted to seize control of the government, storming the imperial palace in search of a surrender recording they believed the emperor had made. The coup had failed, but only barely. The hardliners remained in power, their grip tightening even as the nation collapsed around them. Takeda walked through the tunnels of his headquarters, past soldiers who stood at attention despite their hollow eyes and sunken cheeks. They had not eaten a full meal in weeks. Many were sick with dysentery and beriberi. They would follow his orders without question, charging into American machine guns because a general had told them to die. That was the tragedy of Japan, not that men were willing to die, but that no one had the courage to let them live. He found his senior officers gathered in the deepest chamber, their faces illuminated by flickering lanterns. They knew what the order contained. They had been waiting for it since the invasion began. Some looked resigned, ready to embrace death as they had been taught. Others showed something else in their eyes, doubt, perhaps, or the first stirrings of rebellion. Takeda spoke plainly, without the careful language of military protocol. He told them what he believed, that Japan had lost the war months ago, that every day of fighting now was a day of senseless killing, that their duty was no longer to victory but to survival. He told them about the coup in Tokyo, about the emperor's private doubts, about the coded messages that spoke of peace negotiations that might still be possible. He asked them to choose. The silence lasted for what felt like hours. Then Colonel Ishikawa, the oldest officer in the room, stepped forward. He had fought in China and Manchuria and a dozen other campaigns. He had watched Japan rise to empire and fall to ruin. His voice was steady when he spoke. "I have given my life to the emperor," he said. "But the emperor wants his people to live. What you ask is not treason. It is loyalty to something greater than orders." One by one, the other officers nodded their agreement. Not all of them. 3 men walked out, their faces hard with contempt, and Takeda knew they would try to carry out the attack with whatever forces they could gather. But most stayed. Most chose to live. They worked through the night, sending coded messages to unit commanders across the mountains. The attack was cancelled. Soldiers were ordered to hold their positions but not to advance. Anyone who wished to surrender could do so without shame. It was not a formal capitulation, that would require authority Takeda did not have, but it was enough. By dawn, the guns had fallen silent along most of the front. Takeda climbed to the surface as the sun rose over the mountains. The boy walked beside him, still carrying his unfinished wooden sword. Below, in the valleys, American forces were stirring, preparing for an assault that would not come. White flags had begun to appear along the Japanese lines, not surrender, not yet, but something close. A pause in the killing. A breath of hope. He thought of his daughter, whose photograph still rested against his heart. He thought of his wife, gone now for 2 years. He thought of all the men who had died following orders they knew were mad, and all the men who might yet live because one general had finally said no. He did not know what would happen next. He might be court-martialed. He might be shot. History might remember him as a traitor or as a savior or not at all, but the boy was alive. The soldiers in the caves were alive. And somewhere in Tokyo, the emperor was finally free to speak the words that would end the war. Takeda watched the American soldiers approach his position, their weapons ready, their faces uncertain. He raised his empty hands and waited. The war was not over. The suffering was not finished. But in this one moment, on this one morning, he had chosen life over death. And that was enough. That had to be enough.